Hi, everyone. Welcome to All Free, a podcast for collective liberation.
Feeling the momentum of other people realizing that our liberation is interconnected, that our joy is interconnected, that this is not about being saviors or even allies. This is like what we are all working towards for our mutual liberation.
It's really false notion that the state can provide safety at the helm of other people's lives, as if safety could ever come from harming other people.
For us to be free, everyone must be free.
I'm playing different role and Hannah's playing different role. Dima is playing different role. That it's all contributing into the better world that we wish to see for our children and the future generations.
Today on All Free, we're going to talk about your book, Hannah. You wrote a book. So awesome.
Kind of wild.
And recently published, How to Control the World, a novella. It's got a beautiful cover. I don't know if
Thank
people
you. And you
see
helped
it.
big time with that.
I love it. I love the cover. So it's now available, and we'll talk more about how people can get it at the end. But I wanted to start by asking you, when did this book and this the inspiration to write this book come to you?
So the book is kind of founded on a framework that came to me 7, almost 8 years ago. I had just moved to Lebanon and I had started a project called Why We Fight, where I was interviewing former combatants on basically their personal motivations for taking up arms. And I was also studying a bunch into US Cold War foreign policy, which feels odd to be doing both of those at the same time, but they're super connected. Like so much of what we see on the global stage happening today, especially when it comes to conflict, a lot of that is either rooted in or influenced by US Cold War foreign policy. So I was studying all this stuff. I was conducting interviews. I was talking to a lot of people who lived through the Lebanese Civil War and then also the war in 2006. And it was like something just hit me. I remember being in the apartment in Beirut and kind of just like seeing this abstract concept of some of these forces that convince people to hurt other people, but also convince us to stand by while other people are hurt. And so this concept or this framework of some of the root causes of harm, but also the things that play into recruitment narratives kind of came to me all at once. It's like all of these pieces, all of the things that I was wrestling with clicked. And then I was like, this is probably too simple to be true. So I continued traveling and I traveled to Bosnia and Herzegovina, I traveled to Colombia, I traveled to Northern Ireland, continued to conduct these interviews. And then the framework just continued to be validated. And I tried to disprove it, really. I was like, I just kind of want to prove that this is too simplistic and it doesn't fit. And then I still sat with it after finishing Why We Fight. And I was like, maybe when I'm like 50, when I've lived a lot of life, I'll write a book about this. Because then I'll have all the experiences to validate and the research to validate this concept. So the framework is really based on the idea that there are 4 root causes for systemic violence and oppression, and we can eradicate those 4 root causes either by building resilience to them or by cultivating their opposites. And so I can get into those 4 root causes in a little bit. But that is the framework. And originally I was thinking I would approach it with solutions. And then I decided kind of in the process that it might be fun to start with the opposite as a thought experiment.
Yeah. Well, I feel like it is these 4 root causes, and this book feels just like it can ground people like in understanding what's happening in our world right now, as we see just so much abuse of power, as we're starting to unravel like how these systems have come to be and why people feel like they don't have power, and how people are being manipulated. So it makes sense to me that you would want to try to like validate, not try to invalidate it. Like it seems too simple, but it actually all comes down to these sort of like 4 forces that are being used in certain ways. And how do we build resilience against them. I actually think it would be great to hear from you about the four forces. And then I have lots of other questions after that, but I think getting into what those four forces are, I think will be super helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said about grounding too. I want to touch on that because one of the things that pushed me to write this is that it has helped me so much in my formulation of ideas. Yeah. What I decide to write on, what I decide to speak on, how I approach the scripts that I write for the videos that I shoot for social media. It's like it has dictated so much of my life, and it has caused so much ease for me. So like grounding is such an interesting word that you used, and that's how I felt in this. It's like, oh, I can just put something against the backdrop of this framework, and then I feel like I have confidence in how I'm going to address something. So that was like, oh, I can't sit on this for another 20 years before I share it when this has helped me so much. And it really is one piece in a much broader kind of collection or tapestry of works. It's not the only theory of change. I know there's a lot of theories of change out there, but it's something that has really helped me. So the four forces, there's fear, which is probably an obvious one for most people. Fear is that thing that pushes us to act outside of, sometimes even outside of our own interests or outside of our own values, act outside of integrity, for the promise of like short-term protection, safety, or comfort. The second one is victimization, which is this feeling that you have been wronged, that it's personal, and then the wound remains open. So when that wound remains open, people are very vulnerable to a lot of different things, whether that's feeling helpless or trying to take power over somebody else to feel like they can get their power back. Victimization is really a process of powerlessness and a belief that in this narrative, the narrative of the perpetrator. There's also isolation, which can be physical, but it's more so like the mental and emotional isolation that we feel from each other. So this could be the hyper-individualism that we have in a lot of Western cultures, but it can also just be this illusion of disconnection that we buy into, and this feeling that we don't belong. And when we don't feel that, we can be much more vulnerable to manipulation, and we can also feel like we'll do anything to feel like we belong, which pushes into conditional belonging. Mm-hmm. And then the last one is probably also kind of an obvious one, which is ignorance. And there's lots of different types of ignorance. You can have ignorance of yourself, which could be shame, pride. You can have ignorance of other people, which could be prejudice, ignorance about what's happening in the world, like a lot of the sort of like apathy-fueled ignorance we're working so hard to confront right now. You can have ignorance about power and how power works. I feel like so many of us get stuck in this zero-sum view of power, and healing that view of power is super important. And so ignorance can be created through like direct manipulation, but also it can be created through neglect. Yeah. Just not like teaching and raising up our kids in the next generation to create healthy and flourishing societies. So those are the four forces. And it's not, I do want to emphasize when we talk about the forces, it's not like always up to the individual to not come under their influence. This isn't a book that I had hoped to like demonstrate it as individualism. Oh, we just all must resist this. This is a collective, a collective understanding. And even in countering these forces, it's a collective work.
Yeah, that's a great point. One thing I wanted to bring up is that the book is not a spoiler, but I'm just going to note that the book is a series of letters, and it's letters from an uncle to his nephew about these forces and how to use these forces, and not really for good, but I'm curious why you chose to do the letter format. I love it. I love the letter format, but it's not a format you see all the time. So I'm just like, what was the motivation, the inspiration for choosing this kind of relationship between an uncle and his nephew to be teaching this like use of these forces?
Yeah. So there's two things. One is I think that I wanted to, and I did this as kind of a thought experiment. Like, what would it look like to look at things from the perspective of someone who's using and cultivating these forces for the bad of humanity and for their own pursuit of amassing wealth and power. And through that, I felt like it was an easier teaching mechanism than saying, oh, here's the positive, because there's this immediate feeling when you're like, oh, I do see how people are manipulated in this way. And like, oh, this is, yeah, I can perceive that. So I was raised evangelical, and one of the big thought leaders within American Christianity, and I think he's actually misunderstood, because I think that he would probably be a little bit more controversial today if he was like outspoken about everything he believes, was C.S. Lewis. So the author of Chronicles of Narnia. He also wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters. So this was a book that I really liked when I was growing up, and it's written from like one demon to another, and it was about like how to control this one dude that this demon is in charge of. And it was such an interesting way to think through how we can be manipulated, or like how our emotions can cause us to like lose ourselves or lose sight of our integrity and things like that. So it was a combination of like, I wanted to use the opposite as a teaching mechanism. It's very difficult to do that in like a regular fiction story. I'm also like not an experienced fiction writer. So letters felt accessible for me. Like that felt like something that I could easily do, versus if I was going to write a whole story, it felt that would be kind of outside of what I would feel capable of in a short period of time. And I did feel like I wanted to get this out. I wrote the first draft in a month. I just kind of like sat and wrote, and it was like very intense month. It was January of last year. I was like, things are gonna shift, things are gonna change very quickly in the future, and I want to get this out. And then the other influence was Machiavelli's The Prince, and I know that there's a lot of kind of misconceptions about The Prince, but he wrote it in prison, and he wrote it as a reflection of some of the ruling families in Italy and in Florence and the Medicis and others. And he was explaining how they're controlling things, but it was seen as prescriptive. So he wrote it to be kind of like, this is how you control people, but in a way that would help people understand how they were controlled. So these are some of the things that I was inspired by and played with in this process.
Oh, I'm fascinated by the inspiration. I mean, now it makes a lot of sense, but I had no idea, where that inspiration came from. I'm curious about the process of writing it, just if you don't mind going through it. I remember you telling me that something just came and you're like, I have to do this. And I mean, it's very intense that you did it in just a month. Can you talk a little bit about that process for people who might want to write a book, or this is your first book, so yeah. Right? Or is there another book that I don't know about? So just tell us about that, like that month, but also what you mentioned, that you kind of felt like this was a time you needed to do it, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So the letters I wrote in a month, but I started in August of 2023. I felt this like push. I was living in Athens, and I felt this push of like, you really need to get this framework dialed in, because I had it, but it was more like here than it was here. Right. I had identified some of the forces, but I didn't have like even just the resilience versus the opposite. I didn't have the whole thing kind of dialed in. And so I switched to like part-time in my job, and I was like, I'm going to figure this out. And so I over those months, I really started to collect research and case studies, and I conducted a couple interviews, and I really wanted to dial this framework in, and I have a whole sort of body of literature that I turned to, and so in those months, I really felt like I was like, okay, here are the things, here are the four forces, here's how all of these things work, and then I was like, okay, I guess I could write the book about the solutions, and October 7th happened, and obviously October 7th was not the beginning of the horrors against Palestine. And it was a shift for me, because that is when I shifted my attention from the book to really thinking about what I could do in advocacy, and also knowing my background and having lived in the Levant, and also my background in understanding war and violence and things like this. So I switched gears, but at that point I did construct the framework, but then I was like unsure of what to do with it. It felt weird to talk about solutions just as like a single person. Felt very individualistic to be like, I'm going to tell you how to save the world. Also like, It's very American, very white woman thing to do. So I didn't want to go into that, and it wasn't resonating with me. Then I spent some time with my mom in Colorado in January, and I was like, I just feel like I need to get this out. Like I need to get this out in a way that makes sense. And so I was working on like a couple different things, and I was still volunteering on a couple different things, and I was still posting stuff on social media, but most of my time was committed to writing. So I would wake up and I would sit there at the computer, and I would be inspired by what was happening, both what was enabling so many people or I guess convincing so many people to be silent about this, the limitations on empathy, and the participation in this from people that felt like regular people to people that they knew, maybe Israeli friends who went back into the military, and the things that were fracturing the movement for liberation, the things that were causing a lot of infighting and scandals and things that were really being utilized as tools of divisiveness. And so I was like, I would absorb all of this, and then I would sit and I would write, and I kind of like would word vomit on the page, and some of it needed to be edited heavily and some of it less so. And then right after I wrote it, I just left it for like months. But yeah, that was kind of my writing process. It's interesting because people talk about having discipline in writing, and I agree. Yeah. And sometimes you're just like, now is the time, and you just like push all of this
and you
out.
have to get it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned that you felt like it needed to get out there based on sort of like the time and what was going on. It feels to me that it kind of like was published at like a critical time too. We are now seeing this new administration, and we are seeing power plays that are alarming, and we're starting to be able to connect the dots of just what's going on with a new oligarchy, basically, that we have in power. What are your thoughts on that? How do you feel like this is relevant to our current times, and what can people do with it? What can people like learn and take away from it?
That's a good question. And there's definitely a few things. And I do want to say that like the Democratic Party also utilizes the forces. It's not just the Republican Party.
100%.
And what we're seeing in the US is scary. Like this is, oligarchy mixed with far-right populism, anti-immigrant sentiment, just this very very force-filled movement in the U.S. And I think about not only like we're here, what are we going to do with it? And I'll get into that in a second, but like how we got here. And a lot of it is not a failure to address the growing forces within the U.S., which is a failure to address ignorance, a failure to really, and this is not any one individual's failure, but like these things were brewing for a long time. There was a feeling of, and there's a difference between victimization and false victimization. But that feeling of like, oh, somebody's taking something from us. And so there was like a very real, oh, people feel like somebody's taking something from them. Maybe it's capitalism. And then that's scapegoated, right? And so this was brewing, people feeling underrepresented was brewing. And it really wasn't being adequately addressed, I think, by anyone within our political system. And then also this fear. And I think that social media has a big part to play in this, because fear is a very activating emotion, like anger is a very activating emotion. So like fear is brewing, victimization is brewing, people, isolation was magnified by COVID, and people really, there's this psychology behind when we feel lonely, we feel more threatened. Like it's because our brain sees isolation as an existential threat. That happened, back when we were wandering and we were with our tribe, then that would be like, okay, we can't fight a tiger by ourselves, right? And so all of these things kind of play into, and so many other things, late stage empire and all this stuff, but like it was really a ripe or a fertile soil for the forces. And then when you have that fertile soil for the forces, it's very easy for someone to come in and utilize those. And so Trump, like, was the manifestation of so much undercurrent within the US. So much, like, it's like the icky doppelganger subconscious mind coming up.
Yeah.
And you see the way that the masses are being manipulated into thinking that their neighbors are their enemy, into thinking that the only way to live freely, whatever that means to people, is by really impinging on other people's freedoms, all of these things. And so that's one piece, is how we got here. And the second piece is like, what are we going to do from here? And so the book is written in the context of revolution and regime change and system change. And often we have these periods of time where things shift. Maybe we go from like a monarchy to quasi-democracy, to all of these things, right? And sometimes when these shifts happen, because I think in addition to having this, like the rise of the far right and fascism all over the world, we're also seeing an awakening happening when it comes to, and this is why we're doing this, right? Like when it comes to collective liberation, when it comes into the interconnectedness of our safety and our freedom, this awakening is happening too. And so you have these like two, the bigger this force gets, the bigger this force, or that this power gets, and these things are pulling at each other. And so the book is written in the context of a revolution that's happening and a dismantling, and the ability to say, oh, it's not about one person. It's about a couple people who benefit from all of this stuff. And you could fill that in as weapons manufacturers or whatever you want to say, who it's not about the person who's at the front. They're going to figure out a way to control things as long as we are in a position of being vulnerable to control and manipulation, as long as the masses are buying into a lot of these illusions that are put in front of them that are not for their benefit and that are not for the benefit of humanity. And it's a reminder of how powerful we are as people, as long as we are awake, aware, uncomfortable enough to want change, and like thoroughly bought into the belief that change is possible. Like that is the biggest threat to the class of people I call the manipulators, which is the uncle. It's, it's hard to even know who it really is a manipulator these days, because like who's in the front, who's in the back, backstage, front stage. But it's this idea that like when the people understand their power, and when they're interconnected in it, and when they refuse to be divided in the pursuit of collective liberation, that is an unstoppable force. So there's no amount of like oligarchy, there's no amount of money, like resources. No, people, numbers always win over resources and money, like when these things are in place. And so that's the encouragement of the book, which is like, let's understand what we can do collectively, and let's partner up and do it.
Yeah. I mean, that's beautiful. This just, all of that just gives me so much hope. And it really, the framework is so important. I'm so glad that you did it this way. And I'm so glad that you did it as letters. I feel like you're right. It's an easier way to get into these sort of what can feel like academic kind of ways of looking at things. But it doesn't feel that way in the letters. And it resonates so much to our current time as a way for us to see how we can wake up, and we can help other people wake up to the realities of these forces, and be able to not be manipulated, and to be able to recognize that we do have power to bring collective liberation, to make sure that everybody gets to live freely and safely. So I love that. I want to just ask you, I have the book, but if you want to share how people can get the book,
Yes.
and also anything, what's your sort of dream with this? I mean, how do people get the book, but what's your sort of dream with having put this book out in the world?
My dream is that this would serve as an introduction to the framework, but then also an invitation into the collective work. And that's why we have launched All Free at the same time as this book. because I don't want to just, and I know we don't want to just leave people with like, okay, here's an idea. People need to be activated. People want to be activated. People want to be involved. And so really seeing it as like an invitation into the collective work for collective liberation, into the work of creating a better and more beautiful world for everyone. So the dream is that it's one piece in this big fabric of things that thinkers and journalists and poets and artists and academics have all put together. And that it ignites people and excites people into being involved. Everybody has a part to play in the movement, and we need people's unique perspectives and their unique skills and their unique voices. Like there's a place for everyone in this, and so that's the hope. And then where to get it? You can go to allfree.org / how to control the world. No hyphens in there. You can also find it on Amazon, and then there is an ebook version that is available on our website. So, but if you go to allfree.org / how to control the world, then you can get links to both of those. Thank you so much, Emma.
I am looking forward to people getting this book, joining the movement, and getting behind collective liberation. Thank you, Hannah. It's been lovely speaking with you about the book, and I love that I have it here. It's very special. Thank you.
Thank you.